Today, from Philip DeCourcy on Know the Truth.
The fruit of the Spirit is patience. Aren't you glad God's patient? It's a quality that is the mark of true love, the kind of love that ought to mark a marriage, the kind of love you ought to show to your neighbor who's driving you crazy. Patience. Therefore, it's a quality that ought to be sought and embraced and expressed by every Christian.
An experienced school teacher knows you can't treat every student the same. While that may seem unfair, the truth is some need firm boundaries and strong discipline, while others need gentle encouragement so they can bloom. And the same is true in the church. Today on Know the Truth, Philip DeCourcy offers practical advice for our interactions with fellow believers as we encourage and exhort one another toward holiness. He points to one key attribute that's essential for loving discipleship. In our message, he's titled, Life Together.
As the couple sat down in the pastor's office, it was very evident that they were unhappy. Things were not what they should be. In fact, only a few years earlier, the couple had stood before the pastor and shared their marriage vows. They had a shared dream of life together. There were stars in their eyes. But now the stars were gone. The dreams seemed to be dying. The marriage was on the rocks. And so the pastor addressed the lady and said, "Joan, at your marriage ceremony, you promised to take Jim for better or for worse." To which she replied, "That's right, Pastor, but he is worse than I took him for." And I think this story shows to us that relationships are often more challenging than we expected. People turn out to be much more work than we ever imagined. People are often worse than we took them for. They try our patience. They hurt us. They irritate us. And often they require our help, which can be exhausting and exasperating. And what is true of marriage is true of ministry. God's people are no less challenging than any other people. And that's why you and I need to learn to work at life together. To dwell above with saints we love, that will be glory. To dwell below with saints we know, that's a different story. Life together is work. It requires love, forgiveness, patience. It requires compassion and help to get people to a better place. J.D. Rockefeller said this, "I will pay more for the ability to deal with people than any other ability under the sun." Teddy Roosevelt said the most important single ingredient to the formula for success is knowing how to get along with people. That's exactly what Paul is trying to do here in the tail end of his letter to the Thessalonians. He's trying to encourage them to work at life together. And he sets before us several categories of people and how you and I ought to minister to them. We saw in verses 12 through 13, we have the ministry of the shepherd to the sheep. And in verses 12 through 13, we have the ministry of the sheep to the shepherd. Now in verses 14 through 15, we have the ministry of the sheep to sheep. The existence of pastors does not relieve the church members of their responsibility to care for one another. Church membership is not the same as club membership. Maybe you're involved in a club, a golf club, a yacht club, a cycling club, I don't know what it is, a bridge club. And what draws you together with other people is a common interest in the thing that draws you together. That's what club membership is. It's a gathering of people brought together by a common interest, but that's different from life together in the church. We don't come together here because we have a common interest. We don't come together because we share some common family values or political identity or social perspective. No, we come together because we share a common life. And that's much more profound. You and I came to faith in Jesus Christ, and as I've said on other occasions, when you and I are united to Jesus Christ through faith, we are then immediately united to everybody else who's put their faith in Jesus Christ. Union with Christ unites us with everybody else that's in union with Christ. That's why you have this instantaneous intimacy and closeness between Christians. Because there's something more profound than a common interest. It's a common life. We share the same Spirit. We've got one Lord and one baptism and one faith and one calling. We belong to each other as like members of a human body. We sink or swim together, and that's why we need to learn to do life together. And so we identified here 5 categories of people that you and I will either be at one point in our life or encounter at one point in our life. The first category was the disorderly. That's the unruly. Paul mentions them here in verse 14. What do you do with the unruly? You confront them. You admonish them. You get in their way. This is the kind of person that kind of walks to their own drumbeat and puts everybody else out of step. And that person's got to be confronted and brought back in line. We looked at a second category of people. That's the despondent, the faint-hearted, the little-souled. What are we to do with them? We're to comfort them. We're to come alongside them with encouraging words. We're to give them something to believe, something to hold on to. The third group is what we might call the dependent, the weak. And what's our ministry to them? We're to help them. We're to help them. Paul, on a number of occasions, reminds the strong of their responsibility to lift up the weak. In Romans 14, verses 1 through 6, he says, those who are strong in faith must receive those who are weak in faith. And you and I are to do that. The church, unlike the culture, is not to be marked by the survival of the fittest. The church isn't for people that have got it all together. It's a hospital for the sick and the wounded and the weak. And you and I must tend to them lovingly and patiently, encourage them, embrace them. The church is not to discard the weak or disregard the weak. In fact, one of the great apologetics of the early church was that they put value on every human life. In fact, they took in the kids that were abandoned in Roman society. They cared for the disadvantaged and the discarded. And is it any wonder then we would find a letter in the New Testament written to an early expression of Christianity, and the emphasis is on this: uphold the weak. The word weak carries the idea of being without strength. It could speak of physical weakness. It could speak of someone that's sick and laid aside, and you and I must go and minister to them. It could also speak of someone who's materially weak, from the underclass, from the other side of the track, so to speak. And that certainly was the case with the early church. It's hard for a rich man to find his way into the kingdom of heaven. He puts his trust in uncertain riches. He's blinded by his own self-importance and value and doesn't see himself as a poor and needy sinner. But the poor are more predisposed to hearing the gospel. Their life has humbled them, and they have a sense of great need. And we read in Mark 12, verse 37, that the common people heard Jesus gladly. Man, he was a magnet for the underclass. In fact, we read, don't we, in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 26 of the early church, that not many noble and not many mighty made up their ranks. They were the weak, the ignoble, the discarded, the blue-collar person. In fact, Lady Huntington, who was saved under George Whitefield, said that she was saved by the letter M. She was so glad that Paul didn't say, not any noble, not any mighty, but not many. And this woman of nobility came to Christ and disinvested her inheritance and gave it to Whitefield to give it to the poor and the orphans of his orphanages. Could be that. But more than likely, I think it speaks of a moral weakness, a spiritual weakness, a weakness of faith. Paul talks about that in Romans 14, verses 1 to 6. Let the strong receive the weak in faith. And in that passage, it goes on to talk about those who have got certain scruples, whose consciences are very sensitive. This is an issue picked up in his letter to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 8, verses 7 through 13. You've got him dealing with that issue of the meat. If you know anything about that letter, there were those who'd come to faith in Jesus Christ out of a very pagan background. They would often buy meat out of a butcher's shop. The meat would have come from that which was not used at the temple. And the rest of that meat would have been offered to idols. And as they sat down to eat meat at a neighbor's home, they realized, hey, that's from the temple shop. And immediately their consciences are very sensitive to the fact that's meat that's associated with idolatry and that which is abhorrent to God, that which offends His holiness. And Paul would say to them, look, let me help you there. Offering meat to idols is nothing because idols are nothing. But they couldn't get by that. And so Paul would say, hey, while we know eating that meat is not sinful, for them it's an issue of commitment and loyalty to Jesus Christ, and therefore show some patience to them in that. Give them some room in that. Don't force your brother to eat meat and cause him to stumble. He's weak in faith, sensitive in conscience. That may well be the issue here. If we were to speak of that kind of person today, we're probably talking about a person who's lacking in clarity and confidence regarding God's will, and therefore they're always hesitant to take a step of faith. This kind of person's easily carried away by false or fanciful teaching. They're blown about by every wind of doctrine. This kind of person who's weak could well be someone who's got a lack of self-control over their fleshly impulses and appetites. And certainly in the early years of their Christian walk might indeed fall back and show some moral recidivism back into their old life, and they need to be constantly helped and pushed forward. Certainly those who have got a sensitive conscience, and certainly a sensitive conscience to past sins. They are those who are overly scrupulous about gray areas. They don't know how to handle liberty. And so they're always erring on the side of caution, which makes them prey to legalism. The weak in faith. What do you do to that person? That Christian who's like your 2-year-old toddler, who's just getting on their feet, Remember that when each time the girls broke through that barrier and they get up on their feet, but by golly, from the love seat to the settee, you weren't sure they were going to make it. They were like a drunk man, getting on their feet, wobbling all over the place, weak. They haven't got their legs yet. It's a picture of the young, the immature Christian. What are we to do to that kind of Christian? Well, it's very clear, isn't it? Help. Uphold the weak. Uphold the weak. This is a verb that speaks of keeping close, of holding on to someone, of cleaving to a person. You can read about that in Luke 16, verse 13. In the middle voice, which is the case here in the Greek, it speaks of keeping oneself directly opposite to another to sustain them. It's the picture of the first responder. Can't imagine the carnage that took place in Boston, but, heroes emerged. And while other people were running away, they were running towards the problem. And you saw those photos of loving one's neighbor in a wonderful way, and you see people kind of just standing over or holding and being beside the injured and the bleeding, upholding them. Face to face, you'll be okay. Hang in there. Help is coming. That's the picture here. The weak need to know that they're not alone. It's the picture of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, verses 34 to 35. While the Levite walked on the other side of the road, the Samaritan gets off his donkey and goes down alongside the man who's been robbed and brutally beaten, and ministers to him, life upon life, face to face, lifts him and holds him. Then takes him to the Motel 6 and says, hey, here's a week's worth of bills for the room. Take care of him until I come back. That's the picture here. This is ministry, by the way, then, that's up close and personal. Don't misunderstand me. Calling someone on the phone, great thing to do. We do it. Keep doing it. Writing someone a card or an email, great thing to do. But I think this verb speaks of something more. I mean, if we were just to take it at face value, it probably carries the idea of hugging, holding someone. A little bit of TLC. So the call and the card won't do it. The weak need to know they're not alone. They need that human voice. They need that human touch. They need that human presence. This is ministry that comes alongside, establishes a close personal relationship, and then identifies the problem, inspires the person within the problem, and gives them instruction how they might solve the problem. I hope you've got that ministry. This is what God's calling us to each other here. In 1956, the Navigators held a conference in New York. During that time, June the 18th, Dawson Troutman watched a young girl fall into Schroon Lake and saw she was in immediate trouble, and so he dove in. This is the guy that started Navigators. And he rescued the girl, but in rescuing the girl and holding her up and pushing her up out of the water, he himself went beneath the waves and was never seen again. In fact, the Time magazine at the time published his obituary. And here's what the editors of the Time magazine wrote about that article about Dawson Troutman drowning. It was headed, "Always holding someone up." It's a beautiful epitaph, isn't it? Always holding someone up. Here's a man lost his life holding someone up, helping the weak, ministering to the distressed. That's the third category. Here's the fourth category, the difficult. The difficult. The fourth category is the frustrating and difficult person. And what are we to do with them? Wring their neck? Yeah, no. Be patient. Be patient. As in life, so in church, there are some people, believe it or not, Christians of all people, who will try your patience. You know, you'd rather have a root canal and meet them again. They're crazy. Drive you nuts. They exasperate you. They frustrate you for a whole lot of reasons. The Corinthians frustrated Paul. Read about it in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 1 to 3, where he says, "Hey, I'd love to be feeding you meat, but now you're still on the bottle. It's driving me crazy. You're not growing. You're acting like babies. You're so infantile." And he kind of scolds them. Jesus was frustrated with his own disciples on quite a number of occasions. In Luke 12:28, he'll say, "Oh, you of little faith." What does he say to Philip in John 14, verse 9? "Philip, have I been so long with you? And the penny hasn't dropped? You don't get it yet? When you've seen me, you've seen the Father? I don't understand you, Philip, not understanding me." But Jesus was very patient, wasn't he? John 13, verse 1, he loved his own unto the end. That may be linear. He loved them constantly, but it also carries the idea of loving them fully. There was a fullness about his love toward them that their behavior didn't exhaust. And no doubt, as good as the Thessalonians were, and we've seen a lot of things that commend them, it's very clear by the use of this verse that there were some spiritual slow coaches in Thessalonica. There were some in Thessalonica that irritated and frustrated the leaders and were an irritant in the body. And you and I can't escape that kind of person. In fact, on any given day, we're that kind of person. What kind of person are we talking about? Well, as I said, generally the person that seems slow to learn. They never seem to learn their lessons. Slow on the uptake. Spiritually, they're always needing to be spoon-fed. They never seem to get to a place where they're feeding themselves. They're always needing help. They do what you ask them not to do. They're easily distracted. They hold everybody up. They're inflexible, argumentative, ill-mannered, undisciplined, thoughtless, uncooperative. But the problem with these people is they're not a lost cause. We wish they were, and then we wouldn't have to deal with them. But they're not a lost cause. These are difficult people, but not lost causes. And so you got to get a second wind and come back and show more forbearance and patience with them. Oh, you'd love to give up on them, but Paul says you can't. Show patience towards all. And the fact that he says show patience towards all is that we all try each other at some point. So this is a great challenge, isn't it? We need to show patience. It's a command. It's a present imperative. It means to be long-spirited, long-tempered. You know, you're a person that doesn't come to the boil very quickly, emotionally. Now listen, this isn't a negative acquiescence. Paul isn't saying, hey, Whatever will be, will be. He's not saying don't work to change them. He's not saying excuse their sins, but he is saying show some patience. Show some patience. This isn't a negative acquiescence to their problems. It is a steadfast, active perseverance with the person, hoping and helping them to get to a better place. My friend, it is a quality of God. Thank God, amen. Aren't you glad God's patient? Because we have tried his patience. We have tried his patience, but listen to the words of Exodus 34 and verse 6. You'll find these phrases repeated in like Psalm 103 verse 8. But the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord speaking to Moses, the Lord God, merciful, gracious, long-suffering, and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. We're so glad. God is long-suffering, not willing that any should perish. I had the privilege of growing up in a Christian family. I heard the gospel hundreds of times before I was saved. I remember somebody saying many years later, why should somebody hear the gospel twice when there are those who have never heard it once? But God is good, isn't he? Some of you have rejected the gospel 100 times or 150 times, and God still waits with the offer of mercy in Jesus Christ. Now is the day of salvation. God is outstretched in his hand. Oh, he's merciful. And then when we become Christians, we're like the disciples. We're slow of heart to believe. We must drive God crazy. It's there on the page. Don't you see it? Why don't you do it? No, God's merciful and patient. It's a quality found in God. It's a quality that is the mark of true love. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4. Love is patient and love is kind. That's the kind of love that ought to mark a marriage. The kind of love you ought to show to your neighbor who's driving you crazy. It's a love that's produced by the Spirit. This quality that's found in God is a quality that God by his Spirit wants to produce in us. Galatians 5 verse 22, the fruit of the Spirit is patience. Patience. Therefore, it's a quality that ought to be sought and embraced and expressed by every Christian.
Patience, the continuous theme that should run through all of our admonition, encouragement, and exhortation. You're listening to Philip DeCourcy as he continues a series in 1 Thessalonians called Classic Christianity. Here at Know the Truth, we're committed to bringing you daily lessons of deep, theologically rich Bible study so you can grow in your biblical knowledge and your love for God. And in doing so, we hope we're also equipping you to better serve your local church wherever you are. As these messages have blessed and supported your walk with the Lord, will you partner with us so we can reach even more listeners? Your gift, whether it's $25, $50, $100, or more, enables us to expand the reach of this program so more lives can be touched and congregations strengthened. And when you give, we'll express our gratitude with a beautiful resource. It's a hardcover illustrated edition of The Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan's beloved allegory for the Christian life. This story has resonated with believers throughout the generations because we all relate to the protagonist Christian and the challenges and diversions that try to trip him up as he journeys toward the celestial city. This book belongs in every believer's collection, and if you already have a copy, you may consider gifting this beautiful edition to a loved one this Christmas. So be sure to request The Pilgrim's Progress when you give today by calling 888-644-8811. That's 888-644-8811. Or go to ktt.org. We're grateful for your partnership, and so are your fellow listeners, like one listener in the United Kingdom who called us recently and expressed how grateful he is to have access to doctrinally sound teaching through this program. On behalf of this listener and so many others, thank you for your faithful giving. Well, I'm your host, Wayne Shepherd. Tomorrow, Philip concludes this message called Life Together, so be sure to join us right here on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."